Okay, so in this video, I'm going to show you how to work through calculating main effects for study designs that include 3 IVs. So in these examples, you're going to calculate out 3 main effects and a possible 3 interactions. So let me explain to you conceptually first what we're doing. Because I think for this one, these type of problems, it is important for you to understand what's going on and what you're looking at. So in this kind of study design, we're now dealing with 3 IVs. So you can see here, this is an actual exam question where I'll give you the information. And again, you're looking for the question, and I have the question listed. How many main effects do we have based on this data, right? So you might be thinking, well, you haven't given me any background information. Yes, I have not. That's mostly because you can figure this out without that background information. And I do have some examples that do include background information, but I do have some examples where I'm trying not to overwhelm you with information. Not to say that I'm not going to include those type of examples where I have the background information in addition, but just from this alone, you should be able to solve for the main effects. Okay, so when you have this, the first thing to consider is, well, how do I know there's 3 IVs? You as a student, how are you supposed to know that? Well, take a look at these tables, right? So some of it looks like what we've covered before. Let me change highlighter. Here we have 2 levels of an IV, right? Regular coffee, decaf. And you see it repeats here, right? That's kind of strange. You might think that, but okay, follow me for a little bit and you'll see it makes sense. But then you see here, you have morning and afternoon. Okay, but then here you have morning and afternoon. You can kind of, from that, you should be able to tell, okay, that has to do with time. This green one I highlighted has to do with caffeine or coffee. And the third IV, let me change highlighter color, is here. So the third IV is sex of the participant, right? So the weird thing, not the weird thing, but the only way we can display designs that have 3 IVs is by using 2 tables like this, or sometimes they'll be side by side. So there's no way to display this information like we did before with 2 IVs. We actually have to recreate the same table. So you can see here, essentially it's the same table, right? The only difference is now we have one table for male participants and one for female participants. So let me walk you through this a little bit more. So if we didn't have that third IV, right? Let's say we just had this one here. We would have participants who participated in the morning and who had regular coffee, morning decaf coffee, afternoon regular coffee, afternoon decaf, right? And here I have the DV listed, attention measured during a lecture, right? So this is how much attention they paid during a lecture. I'm interested in seeing how caffeine and time of day impacts this. But then I have this third IV, right? Well, I wonder how this varies between male and female students. Well, when you add that third IV, you increase the complexity of your design. That's why for your designs, I emphasize stick with 2 IVs, because as soon as you add that third IV, it becomes even more complex. Now you have to do the second table, which adds 4 new conditions, because now you want to see, well, how do female and male participants, so this one was male, so how do female participants do in the morning? How well do they pay attention in the morning after having a regular cup of coffee, morning after decaf coffee, afternoon after a regular cup of coffee, afternoon after decaf coffee, right? So now we want to look at that and how that is for female participants and what that looks like for male participants. So that's kind of what you're looking at here. You're looking at this third IV, which requires you to draw it this way because now you have this more conditions to deal with. Now, just to show you a quick hand way to think of this, and it's good to know because we are dealing with factorial notation in chapter 12. We have a 2 by 2 by 2 design, right? Here, this is the first one, could be sex. The second one could be caffeine. And the third one could be time. And I say could because it doesn't matter what order you put these in, right? So you have these different IVs, and they each have 2 levels, right? This one has male, female. This one has normal cup of coffee, decaf. This one has morning and afternoon. So when you have this design, if you want to determine, well, how, before you only had this in the earlier designs we discussed, if you want to figure out how many conditions you have to consider in this design, let's say you only had a 2 by 2. You can multiply it out to figure out the conditions. That would be 4 conditions, right? That is, let me change to a highlighter. Before, we just had to consider this. But now, you've added this. So 2 times 2, 4 times 2, 8. Now we have to deal with 8 conditions. So as soon as you add that third IV with 2 conditions, you've doubled how many conditions you have to deal with, right? So it does get more complex as you add more IVs. Okay, so conceptually, that's what we're dealing with. That's the design we have in this study, right? Now, let's go ahead and work out this question. How many main effects do we have based on this data? So keep in mind, I'm asking how many. Let me go ahead and erase this. It might take a while. We're discussing how many main effects. I might ask you, is there a main effect for caffeine? I might ask you, is there a main effect for the sex of the participants? Is there a main effect for time of day? So keep that in mind. Read the question carefully. See what's being asked. Okay. So this is going to take a while. So because this takes a while, especially with 3 IVs, I've made these questions worth more points. So take your time with this. I know it takes a while. I have reduced how many questions of this type I have in your exam compared to what I've done in past classes. So take your time. You do not want to rush through these questions because you can easily get the wrong answer. Okay, so now let's go back to the meaning of what a main effect is. So remember, a main effect is dealing with one IV at a time. The number of main effects possible is equal to the number of IVs. We have 3 IVs. At most, we can have 3 main effects. The minimum we can have in this situation is 0, right? There could be no main effects. So just keep that in mind. If you see an option in this kind of problem scenario, if you see an answer option that says 4 main effects, automatically you should know that's not an option. So keep that in mind, right? 3 IVs, possibly 3 main effects. So what you need to do now is the not so fun part. You need to average across all these 2 tables to get a new average just for that IV you're focusing on. So let me do an easy one. So an easy one, at least for me, might vary for you, is looking at this one compared to this one. because what you're going to do, right? So I'm checking for the main effect. Is there a main effect for sex? So I'm going to actually write that down. I'm going to average out all the averages for the male participants. I'm going to do the same for all the female participants. Actually, I'm going to delete that because it'll get in the way later. But let's go ahead and do that. 10 plus 2 plus 2 plus 10. Right, we're dividing by 4 this time because we have 4 numbers we're dealing with. Let me fix that so I don't get confused later. And this is for male participants. You want to label it because you might get confused if you don't. I know I do. Maybe you don't, that's fine. Then I'm taking 5 plus 11 plus 11 plus 5 divided by 4, right? So I want to have any number related to female participants added and divided by how many numbers we have, right? So exactly what you're doing is you're averaging for all female participants. What is their score on average? And then here, you want to look for all the scores that have to do with male participants. These are morning participants who went in the morning and had a regular cup of coffee, but they were male, right? We know that they're male because they're in the table that on the top is labeled male participants. So let me go ahead and get a calculator out. Actually, no, I can't use one on there. So give me a second. This one I should have known without a calculator, but there you go. So these kind of work out to really nice numbers, right? They're not always going to work out this way. Sometimes you will have a decimal. So again, I added these numbers up and divided by 4 in each case. For male participants, I got this new number that's 6, and for female participants, I got this new number that is 8. So conceptually, what you've done here is you've recalculated the average for male participants that ignores the other 2 IVs, and you've done the same for female participants, right? So now when we're only considering the sex of the participant, is there a difference between the average for male and the average for female participants? Yes, it looks like the female participants are paying more attention, or in other words, it looks like there is a main effect for sex, right? So this is just one. Right, we've only looked at one main effect so far. We're going to have to do the other 2. Let's go ahead and do that. So now let's go ahead and do caffeine. We have a regular cup of coffee, and we have decaf. We know we're going to divide by 4 because there's 4 numbers we're going to find. And let's look at and see where the regular cups of coffee are. Let me color code this. So, okay, this is regular cup of coffee, right? Let me change to a highlighter. Oops. There you go. So this is a regular cup of coffee. Regular cup of coffee. Regular in the morning. Regular in the afternoon. I'm saying morning and afternoon because that's where they're located. What we're trying to do is just figure out where are all the conditions that included a regular cup of coffee, right? So this might be morning, afternoon. Here we have, again, morning, afternoon. It's for female participants. We don't care about that. We care that it's a regular cup of coffee. So now we add them up. 10 plus 2 plus 5 plus 11. Let me double check. 10, 2, 5, 11. Great. And then The other 4 numbers come from here, right? So decaf, now we're looking for decaf. Here's decaf. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4. This is where it came from, right? It is, like, if you look at it technically, you could see, okay, this one is for male participants in the morning who had decaf. We don't care about them being male. We don't care about them being in the morning. What we care about is that it's decaf. So that's what you're looking for. You're looking for any situation where the participant had decaf coffee. And I kind of blocked that out. There you go. 2 plus 10 plus 11 plus 5. So let me work that out. And again, you can use a calculator. You don't have to do this by hand. Okay, 1 second. Let me get the pencil back out. Okay, so the first one is a 7, because you end up with 28 divided by 4. Okay, so let me go ahead and do that second one. Sorry about that weird cut. I had to make a correction. So let me make sure I have the pen selected. So then here, you would also have a 7. You could, average it out and you'll see you have the same number. But you can just look at the numbers and you'll see you have the same numbers, right? You have a 10, you have a 2, you have a 5, you have an 11. It ends up being the same number, 28, and divide that by 4, you get 7. Because you have the same numbers, you do not have a main effect. So I do want you to keep in mind, though, that even if it was a small difference, in this case, you don't have a main effect for caffeine, right? But let's say you did have a small difference. Let's say you had 7.5 and 7. Outside of this class, you would take into account and think about, is that a big difference? In this class, for the purpose of the exam at least, if there's any difference at all, you're going to say there's a main effect. But yes, if we're outside of this class and we're talking about different types of measurements, you take into account how big the difference is. So for example, if this was years, right, 7.5 years versus 7 years, okay, then we'd want to think about, is that a big difference? If this was seconds, 7.5 seconds versus 7 seconds, we'd more easily say, well, that doesn't sound like a big difference, right? But for the purpose of this class, again, don't worry about that. If there's a difference, you report a main effect. Then again, in this case, you did not have a difference. You had 2 7s, right? So there is no main effect. No main effect for caffeine. Okay, now let's do the last one. Let's see if I can make space. Okay, so that we've done sex, we've done caffeine. The only one we don't have is time. Okay, so for time, let's see if I could erase some of that with my markings. Maybe you won't let me. Oh wait, no? Okay, there you go. Okay, so I like to label them. So I'm going to do morning, afternoon, and I'm going to do, let's see, we know we're going to divide by 4. And let me get the highlighter. Okay, so now we're looking for any condition that was done in the morning. Here we have morning, right? So it's morning for the male participants, regular and decaf, but we're just looking for morning. So here are our 4 numbers, and might as well highlight the other one. So we're comparing that to the afternoon. Here's the afternoon numbers. So see where that came from. Afternoon, afternoon, right? So I'm going to do morning first. 10 plus 2 plus 5 plus 11. And then I'm going to do afternoon. 2 plus 10 plus 11 plus 5. Yeah, so those I just wrote down came from here. That one's for morning came from here. So it's going to depend, right, where these numbers come from. Don't think that there's a shortcut to remember to know where to get the numbers. You really have to look at the labels and look at where that's coming from. Because let's say I gave you this same table, but then I put morning and afternoon here on the side, right? And then I put decaf and regular cup of coffee here. Then you wouldn't work it out the same way. So you really have to take your time to make sure you know where you're getting your numbers from, read the labels for the levels, and keep track of all this. Okay, so let's work this out and see if there's a third main effect. So for those of you who are paying attention, you can kind of even tell before I give you the averages that they're going to be the same number, right? Because here I have a 10, here I have a 10, here I have a 2, here I have a 2, here I have 11, here I have 11, here I have a 5, here I have a 5. Now, don't waste time looking for patterns like this. This is a coincidence. But, you know, when you work it out, you're going to notice this turns out to be 28 divided by 4. 28 divided by 4 gives you 7, gives you 7. So these are exactly the same number. So there is no main effect for time. In other words, there is no difference between the average amount of time people paid attention in the morning compared to the average amount of attention people paid in the afternoon, right? So for this question, finally, and this is why I'm not going to give you a bunch of questions, but these are going to be worth more points, a bunch of questions like this. Finally, we can go back to this and see, well, how many main effects are here based on this data? It would be 2, right? There was one for sex and one for caffeine. Now, I might ask you, is there a main effect for caffeine? If that's the case, you don't have to work all these out. Just look at this table, figure out the levels for caffeine. Okay, regular and decaf. Here they are again. Then work out an average just for regular and compare that average for decaf. And if it's different, then there is a main effect for caffeine. Read it carefully, see what I'm asking. And it might be, you might get confused if you rush through this. You might think you're doing it correctly. This is not beyond anything that any of you can do. It's looking at averages, right? But if you're rushing, if you kind of get a little flustered, you might lose track. You might get confused and pick the wrong answer when you can do this, right? So take your time with these questions. They're worth more points. Read carefully and make sure you understand what's being worked out.